An October morning at Riverside City Zoo began like so many others. Parents pushed strollers at an easy pace, children laughed near the enclosures, and students made their way toward the Predator Pavilion. The rhythm of the day seemed calm and predictable. Then the sharp cry of an alarm tore through the air. A voice followed over the public address system, clipped and restrained. The words carried a weight that could not be softened. A large predator had left its enclosure. In an instant, the crowd transformed. Bags were dropped, toys abandoned, children clutched tight against chests. Sirens split the air while heavy gates clanged shut, yet the sense of safety never came. Security officers sprinted down the paths with tranquilizer rifles in hand, their voices cut into short commands. No one knew the lion's exact location, but everyone knew that seconds would decide fates. And then he was visible. From behind the autumn trees stepped a massive male, his golden mane catching the sunlight like a field of fire. Apollo moved without rush, his pace steady, his posture deliberate. He did not hunt or lash out. His stride carried intent, though its meaning was hidden from all except one man. Walter Harris stood at the main gate, leaning on his cane. The wave of fleeing visitors passed him, their voices urging him to run. Yet he stayed rooted, his face not contorted with fear but sharpened with focus. To many, his stillness seemed reckless, even mad. But within him stirred recognition. The angle of the head, the rhythm of the steps, the subtle weight in the shoulders. Each detail pulled him backward in time. For a fleeting second, as the chaos churned, his memory offered another image. A tiny cub pressed into his palm 2 decades earlier, its breath shallow, its body fragile. The warmth of that moment cut through the cold of alarms. He did not see only a lion in front of him. He saw a life he once held, fragile and dependent, a bond written into the fabric of his own years. The scene stretched painfully long. Security tried to form a corridor. The veterinary director tracked the animal through binoculars, radios buzzed with urgent orders. But Walter remained motionless, gaze fixed, as if the entire zoo had fallen away. Around him the world spun with panic. Within him burned a different knowledge, that what stood before him was not only danger, but memory in living form. And that was why his body refused to run. If moments like this move you, please like the video and write in the comments which city you're watching from. He arrived at Midland Zoo as a bundle of bones and breath so light it seemed borrowed. A mother had turned away. Survival would depend on constant care. Walter Harris did not step in as a savior. He stepped in as a worker who understood that love is a routine carried out with discipline. A small enclosure became a night room, and a narrow cot became his post. He measured weight each morning and recorded it carefully. He mixed formula by the clock every 3 hours, washed bottles until his hands felt raw, and kept notes on temperature and appetite that filled page after page. The first weeks were a quiet storm. The cub whimpered, refused feedings, slept in shallow bursts. Walter stayed close without breaking protocol. He moved slowly, let the cub smell cloth and skin, and waited for the heartbeat in the tiny chest to settle. When the cub stood for the first time, the step was weak yet steady. Walter did not cheer. He wrote it down, adjusted the schedule, and prepared the next bottle. Days turned into a set of family rituals. Morning cleaning brought the soft scrape of bristles and the calm rhythm of water in a pail. Midday brought measured play that taught balance and trust without breaking boundaries. Evening brought quiet observation from the cot as breathing slowed and paws twitched in small dreams. Each routine built a language. A tilt of the head meant curiosity. A short rumble meant discomfort. A slow blink meant rest. None of it was magic. All of it was work repeated until it became care. The cub learned to take meat in small pieces. He learned to follow a hand signal across the enclosure without crossing the line of safety. He learned that a human voice did not promise reward, only structure. Walter learned as well. He learned where fear lives in the body and where calm begins. He learned that patience is a form of protection. He learned that stepping back at the right moment is as important as stepping forward. Months passed. The angles of the cub filled out. Strength replaced shakiness. The record showed steady gains and fewer alarms in the night. Plans were made for careful introduction to other animals. Walter prepared for retirement with the same steadiness he brought to feeding at 2 in the morning. Good care means knowing when to leave a place stronger than you found it. What remained was not a legend, but a set of shared habits. A certain way the young lion lowered his head before accepting contact. A pause that signaled trust. A breath that matched Walter's own. These were family signs written into muscle and memory. They did not belong to one person. They belonged to the work that kept a fragile life moving toward its future. The central path of Riverside City Zoo had become a line of tension, stretched so tight that every sound seemed sharp enough to break it. On one end stood Apollo, his mane stirring with the autumn wind, each step deliberate, measured, familiar. On the other end, at the gate, stood Walter Harris, steady against his cane, framed by the rush of people who had already vanished into safety. Between them lay only open space, shrinking with every second. Security officers formed a corridor, rifles raised but waiting. The command to fire had not come. Chief David Brooks understood what recklessness could unleash. A dart was not a guarantee. A tranquilizer might calm, or it might ignite panic in an animal too strong for mistakes. The team held their ground, torn between training and hesitation. Through binoculars, Dr. Laura Spencer tracked every detail: the angle of ears, the rhythm of breathing, the tilt of the head between steps. None of it matched aggression. The focus was not the crowd, not the guards, but one solitary figure. What she saw did not fit the manuals. The lion's walk resembled not a hunt, but a memory. Walter felt the cold press of wind through his coat, but he did not shift. He knew the weight of each possible move. A step forward could appear as challenge. A step backward could open the door to chaos. The only choice was stillness. The same kind of stillness he had practiced beside a small cot 2 decades earlier, when a cub's breathing steadied under the rhythm of his own. Apollo's strides drew him closer. With each pause, the lion's body spoke in fragments Walter recognized. A slow blink that once signaled calm in the nights of bottle feedings. A lowering of the head that had always meant trust before taking food from a bowl. The echoes of those old family rituals were now moving inside the body of a grown predator. Around them, the crowd that had returned to the edges held its breath. Guards whispered through radios. Yet at the center of the storm, silence formed. Walter's eyes stayed on Apollo. Apollo's gaze did not waver from Walter. It was not defiance that rooted Walter to the ground. It was the certainty of a parent watching a child return from distance, uncertain if the bond still lived. The air carried both danger and recognition. Hope and fear walked together in those narrowing steps. The path was no longer a battlefield. It was a homecoming suspended on the edge of risk. Walter did not think of heroism. He thought of the small rituals that had once kept life moving forward in fragile weeks, long gone. And as Apollo drew closer, the moment became not a test of strength, but a question of whether memory could bridge the years that had passed. Apollo's steps began to slow. The great weight of his body seemed to soften, each stride less about command and more about memory. Shoulders lowered, head dipped. The mane brushed lightly against his chest as if surrendering to the rhythm of the wind. To those trained to read behavior, it was not a threat. It was a sign of caution, of careful recognition. Walter Harris remained still, hands steady on the cane, though he did not lean on it. His eyes followed each movement with the same quiet attention that once guided him through sleepless nights. He did not gesture, did not reach out, did not call. The choice was not his to make. He knew the boundary between human desire and animal autonomy. In that silence, he offered space, the same way he once had when a cub tested the air before taking milk from a bottle. Apollo halted within a few paces, His breathing quickened, nostrils flaring as though chasing a scent hidden beneath decades. The crowd around the edges of the path froze. Security gripped their rifles but did not move. Dr. Laura Spencer marked every detail through binoculars: the angle of the jaw, the tilt of the head, the rhythm of the tail. Nothing spoke of attack. Everything spoke of choice. The lion stepped closer, golden eyes fixed on the lined face before him. For a moment the noise of the zoo receded. Sirens dulled, radios hushed. A pause spread like a held breath across the grounds. Then Apollo tilted his head in a small, almost childlike motion, the same gesture he once made as a cub when uncertain of a signal. Walter exhaled softly. The lion leaned forward, muzzle brushing the air near the hand that had once fed and cleaned and comforted. The seconds stretched long, filled not with danger but with a recognition too deep to measure. Apollo lowered his head until the thick mane brushed the man's knuckles. Walter's fingers pressed lightly, not gripping, not claiming, simply resting in place, as if acknowledging the return of something long believed lost. The contact lasted no longer than a breath, yet it carried the weight of years. It was not miracle or spectacle. It was evidence. Behavior preserved, memory that had not dissolved, trust tested and found intact. Security remained tense, weapons raised, but the atmosphere had shifted. Panic gave way to a solemn respect for what they witnessed. For those around, the moment proved that family is not defined by species alone. For Walter, it was quieter. It was the confirmation that the care once poured into fragile weeks had not disappeared into history. It lived, returned, and stood now in the form of a lion bowing his head in silent recognition. The moment of contact passed, leaving behind a fragile stillness. Around the central path, guards shifted uneasily, weapons still ready but no longer trembling. The crowd that had retreated now lingered at the edges, phones raised, eyes wide. They were watching not a battle but something quieter, a procession about to begin. Walter Harris straightened his posture, adjusting the cane in his hand. He turned his body toward the enclosure with a steadiness that spoke not of command but of guidance. He did not speak. He simply took one deliberate step forward. Apollo followed. The lion's movements held no rush, no panic. He walked as though the path itself belonged to memory, each stride echoing a routine from years ago when he had once trailed behind the same man across smaller enclosures. Guards formed a perimeter around them, boots striking the ground in measured rhythm. Their presence was protective, yet it was the bond between man and lion that kept the procession moving. The atmosphere was hushed, reverent. Visitors who had once screamed now stood silently, as if bearing witness to a ritual. Some wiped tears, others clasped their children's hands tighter. All watched the slow walk of an old man and a lion bound by history. As they approached the enclosure, tension grew again. The gate stood open, reinforced and waiting. Staff checked locks, hands hovering over controls. Apollo paused at the threshold. His gaze shifted from the steel to the man beside him. For a moment, he did not move. His stillness carried weight, as if he understood that a step forward meant the closing of this rare chapter. Walter stopped too, keeping a measured distance. His presence offered neither command nor demand. It offered permission. The lion's amber eyes held his for a long second. Then Apollo stepped across the line. One paw, then another. His body entered the enclosure not with resistance, but with the quiet dignity of choice. The gate closed with a deep metallic echo. Relief washed through the staff. Shoulders loosened, radios buzzed with final confirmation. Yet the moment did not feel like victory. It felt like farewell. Walter remained by the bars, one hand resting lightly against the steel. Apollo turned once, holding his gaze, before settling near the fence. It was not triumph that filled the air, but acceptance. The kind of acceptance that marks the end of a chapter in any family, When a parent steps back, when a grown child continues alone, when love is measured not by possession but by the strength to let go. The zoo returned to order, but the procession remained etched in memory. An old man walking slowly with his cane, a lion following close behind, and the quiet dignity of a bond released rather than claimed. By evening, the crisis was officially closed. Apollo rested again behind reinforced barriers, and the zoo grounds had settled back into uneasy calm. But leadership understood that the day could not be treated as an isolated scare. It was a lesson, and lessons required change. The first step was an audit of the systems. Engineers traced the escape to a rare failure in the electronic locks. The probability had been listed as nearly impossible, yet impossibility had been disproven by a single gap in metal and code. For the administration, it was a signal that technology alone could not be trusted without constant review. Maintenance schedules were tightened, replacement cycles shortened, and new redundancies designed. But responsibility extended beyond steel and circuitry. The day had revealed another truth. Bonds between keepers and animals did not vanish when a career ended. For decades, men and women like Walter Harris had built routines of trust, and those routines held value long after retirement. To ignore that was to waste knowledge, and perhaps to risk safety. In response, a program was created. Retired keepers who had raised animals from fragile beginnings would be invited back under structured supervision. Visits would take place on fixed schedules, with veterinary oversight and security present. These moments were not indulgence or spectacle. They were continuity, recognition that the long arc of care forms part of safety itself. The board also approved new training modules built around the incident. Younger staff would study how recognition and calm behavior could influence outcomes. Not to romanticize the bond, but to respect it as one factor among many in the complex web of animal management. The message was clear. Discipline, compassion, and history all belong in the same framework. Partnerships grew from this realization. Great Lakes University joined with the zoo to launch a research initiative. Data from Apollo's behavior were cataloged. Patterns of response to familiar faces were recorded. Scientists did not claim conclusions, but they opened questions that once had been dismissed. Could large predators carry emotional memory across decades? Could routines of care leave marks that shaped behavior long after separation? The changes were not framed as punishment. They were framed as maturity. Families learn by adjusting, and so must institutions. The escape had been frightening, but it had also forced the zoo to admit that responsibility is not only about containing power behind fences. It is about honoring the invisible ties that shape how animals and humans live together. In the quiet that followed the storm, Riverside City Zoo began to act less like a fortress and more like a family willing to grow, willing to admit mistakes, and willing to transform love into order. The story did not end with a closing gate. It moved into classrooms and staff rooms and family visits to the zoo. Riverside City Zoo partnered with Great Lakes University and built a careful program that treated memory as something that could be observed and recorded. Teams logged Apollo's responses during scheduled keeper presence, noted posture and breathing, and compared those notes with earlier records. Findings were cautious. Patterns appeared often enough to matter. Conclusions remained open long enough to stay honest. Education followed the science. School programs shifted from simple facts about habitat and diet to lessons on dignity and care. Children stood at a safe distance and learned how a slow blink can be a sign of calm and how steady routines protect both animals and people. Volunteers practiced quiet observation rather than performance. Parents read guides that explained why restraint is a form of respect and why the safest choice is the most loving one. Inside the zoo, younger staff trained with new modules that used the incident as a case study. The goal was not to romanticize a bond. The goal was to honor long work that builds reliable behavior across years. Trainees studied how calm presence and predictable rituals helped reduce risk. They learned that a familiar figure could be a factor among many and that no single factor replaces protocols. They learned that love inside a workplace looks like checklists kept up to date, and like radios used with discipline, and like teams that defer to one another at the right moment. Walter Harris returned on a monthly schedule, always escorted, always logged, always under veterinary oversight. The visits were short and quiet. Sometimes Apollo lifted his head and settled near the fence. Sometimes he chose a shaded corner and simply rested. Both outcomes were recorded. Both outcomes were respected. A program that looked like tenderness was in truth a practice of patience. Community days grew from this culture. Families walked the paths and paused to read small signs that spoke about empathy and responsibility. Docents told stories about routine and recovery, not a legend about a fearless man and a tamed lion. A lesson about long care and careful order and the way shared memory can serve safety. Over time, the event felt less like a headline and more like a heritage. The zoo became a place where children learned that strength can be quiet and that love can look like restraint. Staff carried forward the habits that had once saved a fragile life. The research continued. The classes continued. The visits continued. What began as crisis became a resource for a larger family, one that included animals, workers, students, and the city that gathered around them. Afternoon light spilled through the canopy of trees at Riverside City Zoo, breaking into soft gold across the lion enclosure. Apollo lay in the shade, his body rising and falling with the rhythm of deep rest. Walter Harris stood on the other side of the reinforced fence, his cane steady at his side. The years had carved lines into his face, but his gaze remained clear, focused not on danger, but on recognition. He did not see a symbol or a miracle. He saw a life he had once carried through fragile nights, a creature that had grown under the weight of care and order. The day Apollo left the enclosure had been an exception, one that should never repeat. Yet it had also revealed something worth keeping, that the traces of trust built in the quiet work of long ago could remain alive even after decades apart. Walter understood that his role was not to stand as hero. His task was to remember and to remind. Care is not performance. Love for animals does not mean risk. It means protocols observed with discipline, routines honored with patience, teams supported with respect. What the world had called a miracle was, to him, the outcome of steady years spent tending, recording, and staying present. Apollo lifted his head briefly, amber eyes catching the sunlight. He looked toward the man by the fence, then lowered his head again, surrendering to rest. For the lion, it was simply another afternoon. For Walter, it was a final reminder. Memory and trust can endure when they are built on patience rather than spectacle. The story ended without drama, without claim of triumph. It ended as families end chapters, with gratitude, with order, with the quiet knowledge that care continues even when one steps back. The lesson was clear. Love is not measured by holding tight, but by letting go with dignity and leaving behind a structure strong enough to carry others. This story shows that true strength lies not in one person's bravery, but in the shared responsibility of all who guard the life and trust of animals. If it speaks to you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you won't miss new stories. Explore the playlist for more accounts of how people and animals change one another. And a question for you. In relationships between humans and animals, what matters most? Trust, memory, or discipline? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective is part of the larger family this story belongs to.
Don't you bow for the guests invasion? Don't you pass more than hard moment love? Don't you bow for the guests invasion?